Good morning. Good morning, Alfred and Carl and Rick and George. How's everybody?
Cold.
Pretty good.
Excellent. So glad to see you. Good morning, Dave. He's connecting. I know Jack's got to be there. He's just hiding behind Chicago Scots.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh.
There you are.
Just making sure the recording's working.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you all get a notification when you first came on, recording in progress?
Yes.
Perfect, okay.
Good morning, Maureen.
Good morning.
It's nice to
I
see
wasn't sure if I was muted or not.
I wasn't sure either, but we can hear you loud and clear. Good morning. Well, Caroline's connecting, so I'll wait. We're having some interesting weather here this morning in the Chicago area.
I was about to say I'm reporting from Springfield and it's 60 degrees and pouring down rain and 30-mile-an-hour winds. It's crazy.
Yeah,
So
I've been
similar weather.
listening for the tornado. They
Yeah,
say
exactly.
it's like a freight train when it comes. So
Yep.
so far so good.
It looks like the sun has been coming up for the last 3 hours here. Hasn't fully gotten up there yet.
Well, in Montreal, it's beautiful weather and about 75, but it won't be like that in another month or so.
And Malcolm, where are you today?
I'm in Montreal.
Oh la la. Thank you for joining.
Well, my great grandfather came from Prince Edward Island, and he was probably in one of those boats that brought them over. Probably, well, they're from Northern Ireland, I think, and then moved back to Scotland and then moved over here in a part of Prince Edward Island where you have to use the first name to distinguish people because they all have the surname MacLeod. So it has to be Big Black Murdoch or Little Black Murdoch. So I'm fascinated by this.
To a large extent, that was an accurate statement. Good morning, Dawn.
Good morning, Connie.
Good to see you. And Ada's on, I believe, and David. Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning, thank you.
And Sue. Good morning, Sue. And Carl. We have a good group going so far. What's your weather like down in North Carolina, Dawn?
It's actually warm today,
Oh, good.
about 80 degrees. Too warm. I enjoy the cooler weather.
Any chance, Dawn, you're related to Malcolm up in Montreal?
Well, maybe in the old world, but not in the new world, I don't think.
Well, I think it was a feudal relationship anyway that started the names son of Leon, etc. But so we're unlikely to be related.
Good morning, Anne Marie.
Hi, Connie. How are you?
Tremendous, thank you.
Good. I am at the tail end of COVID, so my camera's off and my voice isn't going to hold up. So
Well, you're a trooper. Thank you for being here.
oh, I've been looking forward to this all since you announced it. I'm very interested in this presentation.
Well, Jack and I had a prelude of it the other day, and it's going to be fascinating. So
Oh, that's wonderful.
good call.
Glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
I see Bill there. Welcome, Bill.
No, my family's from Prince Edward Island. My grandfather immigrated from there.
Well, this should be super interesting for you, and I'm sure you'll have a number of comments afterwards. So we'll look forward to those.
Good to hear your voice, Bill.
Who's that?
Maureen Mulhall.
Oh, hey, how you doing?
I'm good.
Down in Springfield.
Yep.
Very good. Oh, this is
And I see Professor MacDonald has joined us. Forgive me. Good morning. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, folks. What a lovely thing to hear as I tuned in. There was a man saying, oh, I have my own roots on Prince Edward Island.
yeah, I've never been there. My brother has.
Well, it's a long way from the road.
How's your weather this morning, Dr. MacDonald?
The weather this morning on Prince Edward Island is 3 times as warm as the seasonal norm.
Wow.
Going to be
does that
70
mean?
degrees today, which is probably will set a record. And sunny. So whether that's an aberration or global warming.
Yeah.
We had a hurricane here in September, which caused an enormous amount of damage. But we are resilient.
Well, so you've made some progress with the cleanup and so forth?
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of the trees, we lost tens of thousands of trees. And I would say most of them are cleared now, at least from the road and the yards. And, everybody has their power back, which is always good. It took 3 weeks in some places. But
What a pity. We're so sorry.
well, I know in your part of the world, you have pretty severe storms as well. So I don't think we can claim any kind of, victimhood. But thank you for your good wishes.
There must have been a lot of erosion also.
Yeah, some places between 15 and 30 feet of coastline in one huge gulp, which, yeah, is pretty bad. And the island is soft stone and clay, so it erodes very easily. So are most members from the same area, Chicago area, or do you have, folks scattered all over the Midwest?
We're a bit scattered. I'll mention a couple and then maybe anyone else can speak up, but Malcolm McLeod there is calling in from Montreal, Canada this morning, and Don McLeod's down in North Carolina. Who else is remote this morning?
It's
Sorry.
Maureen, and I'm calling in from Springfield, Illinois, the state capital.
Very good.
And this is Rick. I'm calling in from River Forest, Illinois, so Chicago.
Welcome.
This is Caroline, and I'm calling in from Chicago, from the Admiral at the lake.
Very good. It's beautiful.
I'm Elizabeth from Riverside, Illinois.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth,
Hi there.
nice to see your face.
Yes, good to see you.
Now I know, Jack, we we tried this out before, but I know that your intention is to allow me to share my screen. And when we get to that point, I'll be showing you, my PowerPoints. Since you probably need some pictures by the time I drone on for a while. But I see the share screen function, so it looks good.
Yep, you should be all set up.
And we typically start at 10 and start with a couple of announcements to give latecomers a chance, and then we'll make sure we've got you up on the screen. Not to worry.
Well, that's just fine. That's just fine. I'm glad to be asked.
John Manchester, where are you calling in from this morning?
Oh, I'm in Island Lake, like normal, which of course is a heck of a long way away from North Riverside. I don't know if the video is going to work or not.
I have a problem in that I live in Elgin, Illinois. And Gus has told me that I have to get everybody in the city to pronounce it Elgin.
Well,
Which is
Lord
pretty
Elgin might
difficult.
pronounce it that way, but the city pronounces it a different way.
I don't know how it got changed, but there is an Elgin, Texas, which they pronounce it correctly, but it's pretty difficult to get 200,000 people to change their mind.
Excuse me, I'm a native Texan, and down there they pronounce it Elgin.
As well.
Elgin?
Yes. I don't know why. I'm not from there. I'm from the Gulf Coast.
You'll have to change that down there too.
I'll do my best.
So would it be fair to say that the folks who are here have Scottish in their background, in their family trees? I know obviously there are a lot of Scottish names here on the screen, but pretty much everyone, or some people just somewhat akin to the Scots, even if they're not a blood relation.
I'm a Campbell.
I'm a
We won't hold
Fraser.
that against you.
I'm a Fraser.
You want it. You want it.
Sandy, you better speak up. He's a Kerr.
Well, with a name like Alexander Duncan Kerr, I guess there's no question.
Yeah, I think
Alan,
there's a
and the red
message
and black
there.
behind me is McFarlane. That's the oldest of our tartans.
I see that background.
Go ahead. That's great.
Yes, I come from I'm a Dawes and a Bond, and we are Scottish. And we came over, I say, about, oh my goodness. It's lovely. I remember so well.
Of 3 or 4 generations ago,
Yeah,
yes.
well, I've been, our generations, they're about 7 or 8, and we came by boat, which is like lively, in about I'd say perhaps 18th century.
Okay.
Johnny's been in Montreal her whole life. I'm from New Brunswick, so I was brought in for breeding purposes.
So you won't need to see, my map, to show you where the island is in relation to the rest of Canada.
No,
I think you're already set.
I think we're set on that.
Yeah.
I will anyway. I'll show the slide. Oh, there's a chat feature as well. Have to keep our eye on the chat feature.
Hello, I'm a Mackenzie from Los Angeles.
Oh la la. We can't see your name. Who
Reg.
are you?
I'm Richard Mackenzie from Los Angeles,
Well, welcome, Richard.
Mount Allison University, which is in New Brunswick. Former Canadian, lived in Montreal.
Beautiful. And to answer your question, Ed, I would say by and large, almost everybody has Scottish ancestry, or they're, first generation and haven't been over here too long.
I see in the chat, Barb has Scottish heritage by marriage. Someone who lived to be 104. Scottish by
Wow.
inclination. Well, that has to be welcomed as well.
Well, folks, I'm showing 10 o'clock Central Time. So I think I'd like to go ahead and get the forum started, if I may. And I'm Connie Nestor, and I've had the distinct pleasure of chairing this forum for the last 10 years. And I want to wish you all a very heartfelt welcome this morning to the Scottish American History Forum. And I believe you all probably know that the forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois way back in 1845. Later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, which is located in North Riverside, Illinois. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, forgive me, in addition to support of the Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care Campus. For additional information and events, please access our website, www.chicagoscots.org, and please give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care Charity. Now, but before we begin, with question and answer at the end, Professor MacDonald, we would like to introduce Gus if he's on the phone. Gus Noble, are you here? I don't think I quite see Gus yet. Gus is planning to fly off to Scotland tomorrow. And so he said he was going to try to be on this morning. I know he had a number of conference calls and conflicts, but perhaps instead I'll have the pleasure of introducing one of the vice presidents, Dawn Miller. And Dawn, maybe you can say a few words. I'm hoping you'll comment on our upcoming gala on December 2nd.
Thank you, Connie, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful, wonderful program that we get to do once a month, thanks to Connie's great leadership. So the Feast of the Haggis is the oldest black tie event in the city of Chicago. We have done it 177 consecutive years without fail, and even during COVID, when we couldn't get together, 3 people met on the corner to have a toast so that we could officially say we consecutively have not missed a year in 177 years. What we do every year is celebrate Scottish identity and have Scottish fanfare and celebration for the evening. We honor a distinguished citizen, a kinsman and a kinswoman of the year, for volunteerism as well. This year's honorees are Richard Colburn, president of the Negaunee Foundation. The Negaunee Foundation, of course, right before lockdown, had given us a very generous $2 million gift and a $1 million challenge. And when our doors were locked to our campus, thank you to all of our donors and supporters and people who are interested in our cultural and elder care mission, we met that match. So we are going to be honoring the Negaunee Foundation and thanking them. And then also for our Kinswoman of the Year, Connie would never talk about it herself, but it's Connie Nestor. We are so excited that we are going to be honoring her for her board service as a member of our Board of Governors, and also for 10 years of running this forum that during COVID then in the digital era just expanded. We are reaching people across the country and around the world. So Connie, we are grateful for your service. We are also going to honor Jim Sim. He is president of the Midwest Pipe Band Association. And over the years at our Highland Games, which is the largest, one of the largest in the country, and certainly the largest in the Midwest, we are proud to host the largest pipe band competition in North America ever. So Jim has grown that over the years and made that possible. So we will be honoring 2 outstanding volunteers and certainly then a wonderful philanthropist. All of that is on our website. We welcome everyone who is Scottish by birth, heritage, or inclination. And I'm Scottish by inclination. But fortunate that my daughter, who got married last year, married someone from the McLaren clan. So I get to come in sort of through the back door. I love the values. I love the cultural mission. And Connie, we're very grateful. Thank you for letting me say good morning to everyone. Please check out our website or just even send me a chat message if there's something I could ever do for you. Connie, thank you. I'm looking forward to today's program. We just know that this is a history lesson we're looking forward to hearing.
Dawn, thank you so much. Thank you for those words and for being with us. And I do want to encourage even those of you from far away to try to attend our Feast of Haggis this year. It's Friday, December 2nd. We're holding it at the Chicago History Museum. Lots of venues in that building. And, we'll have the address to the haggis and toast to the lords and the lassies and pipe drum bands and Highland dancers. And it promises to be a glorious and colorful evening. So we'll hope to see you all there. Now, I know you're anxious to hear from Dr. MacDonald, but I have one more really, really important announcement. And that is, we are not going to be convening a history forum meeting in December. This is very unusual, but we have a host of conflicts surrounding the December 2nd gala. And so our next history forum meeting is going to be in January. So I'll want to wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays early, but we're hoping to see you all back here in January. And the other important announcement, other than the fact that I promise we have a brilliant program planned for 2023. We've already got the lineup for the first 5 months and a few other months. But we are going to be convening on the 2nd Saturday of the month, starting in 2023 at 10:30 a.m. Central Time. And we believe this is going to overcome a number of annual calendar conflicts that we've been challenged with over the years. So we hope it will be more convenient for you as well. The 2nd Saturday is at 10:30 Central Time. And now, without further delay, I would like to go ahead and introduce Professor and Dr. Edward MacDonald from the Department of History at the University of Prince Edward Island, Canada. And Ed is going to speak to us about Scottish settlement of Prince Edward Island and its implications for island society and culture. So Jack will be dimming your cameras and muting everyone until after Dr. MacDonald has an opportunity to speak, and then we'll open the floor for questions, answers, and comments. So thank you. Take it away, Dr. MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Connie. I have been on the website now, and you do fantastic work. So my compliments, and I'm amazed at the amount of money that you're talking about. So Connie said rather than introduce me, she would get the speaker to introduce themselves. And that's always a risky thing to do and also a hard thing to do. So I am a MacDonald, which is the commonest name on Prince Edward Island, as last names go. And on Prince Edward Island, the percentage of islanders whose origin is Scotland is the highest of any of the provinces in Canada, even though there's a province alongside us that gets all the kudos for that because their name translates as New Scotland. I'm from Prince Edward Island originally. I grew up in a rural area where the culture of the rural life that was so dominant on Prince Edward Island for a century and a half was beginning to die out. but the patronymic system that was used for naming was still in effect. So I was Eddie Mickey Jerome Big Angus when I was a kid, or just Eddie Mickey for short, after my father, my grandfather, and great grandfather. So having said that, I teach here at the provincial university, and the specialty that I have is the history of the province I was born in, which is a rare specialty in Canada, and I think even more so in North America. But I teach island history to our students, and one of the things I teach is immigration history, and one of those immigration histories is the history of the Scots immigration to PEI. So I wanted to give you a lecture to give you some background on that. Some of you are originally from Canada, some of you from the eastern half of Canada, and you already know all about us on Prince Edward Island. Some of you might not be able to find us on a map. And since we all want you to come here to be a tourist on Prince Edward Island, I'll try to recruit you as I give this talk. So I'm going to try sharing my screen, and we'll go through the slideshow, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. I'm anxious to hear your comments and your questions. But the first technical hurdle is sharing screen. And I believe this is the screen I want to share. And there it is. Now, if someone could unmic just for a second to let me know whether or not you can see the screen.
We can see it full screen.
Excellent. I did this painting. No, I didn't do this painting myself. This is a painting from 1865, a romanticized view of the emigration from the Highlands of Scotland, especially. This is called The Last of the Clan. I was toying around with some titles for the talk, and I settled on a dance called America, and that's a reference to a dance that was prominent once in the Highlands and witnessed by Boswell and Johnson on their tour through the Highlands. And it was a bit like a snowball, if you're old enough to have been involved in that kind of dance. Two people started to dance while the rest of the crowd stood around the perimeter of the dance floor. And one by one, they joined until everybody was whirling around the floor. And they called it America because that was the way of immigration in the Highlands of Scotland had become like a mania. Once the first few families left, it was like an epidemic that swept through communities. And soon it seemed everyone was leaving. So when I talk to my students about immigration, the classic way to discuss that is the push factor and the pull factor. And we're going to talk a little bit about the push factor, even though I think probably you know a great deal about this already. And so I'll try not to linger too long over the issues pushing Scots people out of Scotland, especially from the Highlands of Scotland. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pull factor and look at some of the patterns of immigration to Prince Edward Island that made us such a Scottish place. So for those of you not from Canada, here's a little map showing where my province is in relationship to the rest of British America. This is a recreation of what Canada looked like in 1867. When, by the way, we chose not to be a province of Canada at that time. Scottish immigrants came to Prince Edward Island from all over Scotland. However, predominantly they came from the Highlands of Scotland, and especially from the Western Highlands of Scotland. So this little map, which valiantly tries to show you clan boundaries, which were fluid over time, I've just used it to identify the major nodes of Scottish immigration to Prince Edward Island. I'm only going to spend time concentrating on the two largest nodes, A and B, the MacDonald's estates from the Western Highlands and the island of Uist. Clan Ranald MacDonald is the largest of the subclans of the Clan Donald, and the Clan Donald, as you know, is the largest of the Scottish clans. And Skye, the island of Skye and the adjacent islands and mainland, also full of MacDonalds, as it turns out. I've kind of bundled A and C together into one. We won't be talking about, and it's not because of a prejudice that I have on the part of the MacDonalds and Campbells and their traditional feud. I dated a Campbell in high school, put the feud to an end myself. But the Argyll area, supplier of probably the third largest group of Scottish immigrants to Prince Edward Island, and then smaller numbers from other parts of Scotland. I'm going to come back to this map several times, probably over the course of the lecture. This is a little map showing you the island of Prince Edward Island and color coordinating the concentrations of Scots immigrants and where they were from. So as you can see, the blue is the clan, Ranald MacDonald's. The red are Isle of Skye people. And then Argyll and Perth, those would be the largest groups. There are a lot of different ways to slice and dice and analyze the emigration from Scotland. There are a lot of immigration scholars who have looked at this. One simplistic sort of a generalization, which is still reasonably valid, is that prior to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, prior to the Battle of Waterloo, Highland Scots tended to emigrate by choice, either to improve their circumstances or to preserve their standard of living. A people's clearance, it's been called by Bumstead, one of the leading historians of 30, 40 years ago. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there's more of a tendency for Highland Scots to emigrate as a last kind of resort, that they were pushed rather than pulled. So one implies a level of agency and one implies a level of urgency. And of course, there are always exceptions to prove a rule. So I don't want to pretend that everyone's history falls within the categories here. But as you can see, it's a little bit of sop to our pride to think that we left because we had a choice and calculated our choices. It's also often said that all of the Highland Scots who came to North America came here because they had been cleared from their land in order to raise sheep. Now, the clearances, as they're known, are obviously not a myth. They were a reality. And it was a rolling ball of disaster that gradually made it through, its way through most of the Highlands, beginning in the mid-1700s and extending to the mid-1800s. As it turns out, on Prince Edward Island, until the 1840s, most of the Scots who came to Prince Edward Island had not been cleared. Fear of the clearances was part of their rationale, but they literally had not been cleared off their estates. At most, for many of those people, they had been cleared within their estate from their run rig system of land holding, which was scattered across a landscape to concentrate them in crofts that were too small to be able to pay your rent unless you went to work for the landlord. But most island Scots immigrants had not been cleared, as I said, until the early 1840s, when we received a large sort of contingent over several years, especially from the Isle of Skye. The reason that people emigrate, if it could be reduced to a formula, is something like this: when your fear of the future where you live is greater than your fear of the unknown, and you can emigrate, then you will. And that was the formula at work in Highland Scotland in the second half of the 1700s. The clan system, which had governed the society of the Highlands, was slowly imploding, in slow motion, falling apart. The clan chief and his relationship to the clan, which was semi-feudal, semi-tribal. The clan chief was the landlord, but he was also the patriarch of his people, responsible for the welfare of the clanspeople. He was their military leader. He was the provider of justice and patron of the arts. Beneath the clan chief were the tacksmen or laird class, who were the officer class in his army, but also a kind of intermediate landlord who rented large, tacks, as they were called, of land from the clan chief and sublet those farms. And then, of course, there were the clansfolk. That structure was under a lot of strain by the late 1600s. It was under even more strain by the mid 1700s. And of course, the catalyst for the collapse of the clan system was this final quixotic, uprising called the 45, where Bonnie Prince Charlie, shown here before it became old, disillusioned, drunk, but when he was young and romantic and full of hope, tried to take back for the Stuart family the throne of England and came astonishingly close. But the uprising was crushed at the Battle of Culloden, just outside Inverness in 1746. And it was followed by the pacification of the Scottish clans. And again, if we were doing a class on this, we'd talk about it more. I know you're interested in the PEI end of this, so I'll just go through it fairly quickly. A number of steps were taken by British officials to pacify the Highlands. One of them was to make them more accessible by the construction of roads, so troops could be moved in and out, the construction of forts and garrisoning of them, the absorbing of the martial spirit of the clans by recruiting clansmen into the British Army in Highland kinds of regiments, seizure of estates, but really the power of the clan chiefs was subverted by cultural imperialism. They were seduced into trying to be like British aristocrats, or English aristocrats, I guess I should say. There was a suppression of aspects of the culture, including the tartan and the bearing of weapons for a period after the 45. But most importantly, clan chiefs were assimilated into the values and the norms of the British aristocracy. And increasingly, they turned their backs on those ancient reciprocal obligations associated with the clan system. Of all those relationships, the one that was left by 1800 was the economic one. The clan chiefs' estates were sources of money. The clan chiefs no longer tended to live among their people, and they no longer fulfilled that kind of patriarchal function. And if you're trying to wring as much income out of your estate as you can, then you hire professional estate managers. And among other things, they discovered that in many parts of the Highlands, the most economical, prosperous return on your investment was to raise sheep. And so Highlanders started leaving. And before the Revolutionary War, a lot of them came to the Americas. They came to what's now the United States of America. And relatively few of them were coming to what's now Canada, but some of them were. And some of them were attracted to St. John's Island, as we were called until the province or the colony was renamed in 1799. The trigger for that was a comprehensive survey commissioned by the British Board of Trade and Plantations, because they were getting a lot of queries about people wanting to acquire land on Prince Edward Island. It had been a colony of France until 1763. It was largely unsettled by Europeans, but it had acquired a reputation as being almost entirely arable land. And that was unusual in that part of North America. And so people were inquiring about getting land grants. Some of them wanted the whole island. Some of them wanted just land on the island. And so the British authorities said, hey, we need to know what it is we're getting. So they appointed Samuel Holland, who was an engineer in the British Army, a surveyor and engineer in the British Army, originally from Holland, to conduct a comprehensive survey of all the British Empire north of the Potomac River. And he started on Prince Edward Island. And as you can guess, he didn't finish because the Revolutionary War intervened. He was down in New Hampshire, I think, when the Revolutionary War started. But he started on Prince Edward Island, and he conducted the first accurate, comprehensive survey of the colony to be. And he divided it up. This is a photograph of the original map. We had it back from England in an exhibit in 2015 for the first time since he drew it in 1765. And it's a humongous map. It's 9 feet by 14. Beautiful map. It was often engraved, and this gives you a better view of the townships into which he divided the colony, 67 of them. And in 1767, in a single afternoon, the British Board of Trade and Plantations lotteried off each of those lots, all but one, to people that the Crown wished to reward, who had an expressed interest in acquiring property on Prince Edward Island. In all, 98 of them. Some of them aristocrats, some of them army officers and their enlisted men looking for property to settle on after the end of the 7 Years' War. Some of them merchants involved in the fishery. The whole island was delivered into the hands of a handful of absentee landlords, as they were called. And in return, here, by the way, this is from an engraved map in 1775, and it's the list of the proprietors as it existed at that time. So if you just want to take a look at that, I'm from lot 54, and the proprietor was, Robert Adair, who was the personal physician to George III. As an example, but you see Viscount Townsend, the Lord Advocate of Scotland, James Montgomery. You see a couple of MacDonalds there who had acquired their land fairly recently, lot 36. Captain Holland himself came up with some land. In return for this free land, they were obliged to bring out Protestant settlers, but not from any part of the British Empire outside of America, and only from America if the settlers had been in America for at least 1 year. So I don't know where they were thinking they were going to recruit them. I think in Germany, Switzerland. And in fact, and they were supposed to pay a quit rent, an annual sort of a tax to the Crown. In point of fact, not one proprietor ever fulfilled the exact terms of their grant, because the proprietors who did bring out settlers brought them out from the British Isles. And increasingly, they brought them out from Highland Scotland. And Highland Scots came on their own. And many of the proprietors didn't bring out any settlers. And that would take me a whole course to explain. Here are some statistics, however, finally getting to Prince Edward Island and immigration from Scotland. Of known vessels arriving on Prince Edward Island with settlers between 1770 and 1811, 60% were from Scottish ports. Now, the numbers here may seem low, but relative to a small colony in its infancy, it's the proportions that are perhaps more important. The percentage of vessels bringing immigrants from Scotland declined after 1811, but only because vessels were coming with immigrants from many other places. The actual number of vessels, 638, may only be a small, that's the total number of vessels. The number of coming from the Scottish ports is smaller, but the actual number of immigrants they brought out is larger. Most of them are Gaelic. Most of them speak the Gaelic language. In fact, by 1855, which is the end of the settlement era on Prince Edward Island, since our major resource was land, and by then the land was occupied or spoken for, the second language of PEI after English was Gaelic. So, with that as kind of a general outline of why people are leaving, and the division of Prince Edward Island into townships and the obligation to bring out settlers and the general flow of immigrants out of Scotland anyway, I want to talk about the two largest settlement groups. And the first of those is something that is known in PI history as the Glenaladale settlers. And little engraving there off to the left. This is from the famous book of engravings by McKeon, I think. And this shows you chieftain of the Clan Ranald, because the Glenaladale settlers were from Clan Ranald. Now, this works better with young students who have seen the Potter movies, but I always ask them, do you recognize that viaduct there? And of course, it figures in every one of the Potter movies. But I actually want them to focus in on the monument off in the distance at the head of Loch Shiel. And it's this monument, which was raised in about 1815, I can't remember exactly, in Glenfinnan at the head of the loch, to mark the site where Bonnie Prince Charlie raised the royal standard to rally the clans to his cause in 1745. And it's quite a dramatic story. For a while, it looked like nobody was going to show up for the rendezvous, that his appeal had fallen on deaf ears. And just when he was beginning to lose hope, 800 Camerons came marching down through the passes, and the 45 was on, even though only some clans people took part. There's the statue that's on the top. I don't know if anyone's ever been to visit that monument. If you do, watch your head. When you get to the top of the stairs, it's a very low lintel. A German tourist, behind me nearly knocked himself out when he was trying to get up there. Bonnie Prince Charlie had stayed the previous night with the Laird of Glenaladale, who was a tacksman or Highland Laird, related by blood to the chieftains of the Clan Ranald. And their mission traditionally was to guard the passes leading into Clan Ranald lands. And this is the Glenaladale estate. I didn't get to travel there when I was in Scotland because it was private property and I was Canadian, so I was very respectful of that. So I had to find this on the internet. It's no longer in the hands of the MacDonalds. Alexander MacDonald's son, John MacDonald, the 8th Laird of Glenaladale, quite a remarkable person, spoke 7 languages, had been educated in Germany, prideful, something of a surprise among Scots, it would appear, a little bit willful, but admirable, and a gift of the tongue. If you were going to be abused by someone, you wanted to be abused by Captain John MacDonald because he was brilliant at vilifying people. This is the only known image of him. When he took over his father's estate, he could see there was no future for the tacksman class in Highland Scotland. Their estates were leased from the clan chiefs, and the clan chiefs were increasingly turning to professional estate managers, factors. And he didn't think that his chances were that great in the Highlands. So he decided he was going to leave and move to North America. And just around that time, he found himself connected because the Clan Ranalds were among the only Scottish clans that had at that point remained largely Roman Catholic. At that point, he was contacted by the bishops of the Catholic Church in Scotland. Now, you have to remember that the Catholic Church was operating on sufferance of the British authorities. It was technically illegal to have a hierarchy in the UK, and it was pre-emancipation, so Catholics were not allowed to vote or to hold office. Some Scottish landlords were pressuring their clanspeople or tenants to convert to Protestantism. Particularly, there was an ongoing example on the island of South Uist, where the Laird, Colin, Boysdale, was supposedly, although this is tied in with a larger kind of legend, he used to stand at the crossroads on Sunday morning with the staff in his hand and try to drive the tenants to the Protestant church instead of the Catholic church, because he was a convert to the Protestant faith, and I think he had all the zeal of a convert. So how the bishops said to themselves, can we protect Catholic Scots who are under a double oppression? The British are oppressing us because we're Highland Scots, and we're getting oppressed because we're Roman Catholics. How do we combat that when we're not even supposed to officially exist? We obviously can't publicly protest or threaten. The only leverage they felt they had at this point was to threaten to depopulate the estates of any oppressive landlord who did not respect their tenants' Catholic faith. Now, you have to remember that while some places in the Highlands are being cleared at this point, in general, the attitude of the landlords is they want a cheap pool of manpower. They're anti-immigration. By the 1820s and 30s, they can't get rid of their tenants fast enough. But in the 1770s, this is 1770, 1771, that is an actual, real, useful threat. But they can't do it publicly. And so quietly, they approached Captain John MacDonald, a well-known Catholic leader, to say, will you lead an emigration of Catholic Scots from South Uist to North America? And he said, I will. And he bought an estate on Prince Edward Island. He bought 20,000 acres on lot 36. And he sent his agents over to the island of Uist, shown here on the bottom right, to recruit the disgruntled Catholics to come with him to North America. And as it turns out, most of them said, no. He wasn't well known in that part of Scotland. And Colin of Boisdale had relaxed the persecution of which he was accused because he didn't want to lose the tenants. And so as it turned out, only about 55 people, 11 families actually signed up to move to the New World on Prince Edward Island with Captain John. He was later known. Most of the people, half of the immigrants, came from the Moydart area, the western mainland of Scotland, here in the upper left, where Captain John MacDonald was, in fact, well known and well respected. So a little over 200 of them boarded a vessel. This is a rather difficult to see map showing you the Moydart area. Many of the place names in Moydart get transferred to Prince Edward Island, including Glen Allendale and Glenfinnan and Alisary, Castle Cheerham there. Here's a recreation of the vessel he chartered, the Alexander. He offered them 999-year leases, as opposed to yearly leases that many of the tenants were enjoying in Scotland, or not enjoying, I should say, in Scotland, at reasonable rates. Of course, they were settling a wilderness. And they came over to the Tracadie area. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's Tracadie. There's lot 36. Ultimately, he acquired the adjacent lot, lot 35 as well. And while what he expected, Captain John got his name Captain John because during the Revolutionary War, he actually enlisted in the British Army and served in the British Army because he was starving to death trying to be a landlord in the Tracadie area because most of the tenants couldn't pay their rent because they were newly settled in a wilderness. Captain John was trying to recreate the clan system relationship in the New World. He expected obedience and deference and gratitude from the settlers he brought over. And what he found out was they were remarkably ungracious and remarkably lacking in gratitude. And if they didn't like what Captain John MacDonald told them to do, there were lots of places, uninhabited places all along the coastline where the landlords were either lenient or totally absent, where you could just move. But the general reaction was that life on Prince Edward Island, St. John's Island, as it was called then, was good. And subsequent waves of immigrants from the Ranald regions of Scotland followed in the footsteps of the settlers of 1772, including a quite large group of 300 in 1790, and my own ancestors in 1806. And they spread like an ink spill all along the northern coast, the northeastern coast of Prince Edward Island, and the eastern coast as well, over the next 50 years. So they continued to trickle in for about 50 years after that, because once you have people, and you've experienced this yourself, I'm sure, in researching your family trees, once you have a group of people, a critical mass of people who have moved to a new place, they act like a magnet, and they draw after them their kinspeople, their families, their relatives, people from their communities, if where they go is a successful transplantation. And that's what happens here. This is just a map of part of the MacDonald estate in lot 36, and it shows you some of the transfer of names. There's your Moydart, Glenaladale, Bedford Bay. For those of you who are Canadian, Captain John MacDonald is perhaps, he cuts along a big path through island history, not well known in Canadian history, but his grandson did rather well for himself. His grandson was William C. MacDonald, who founded Export A Tobacco in Montreal and gave the equivalent to McGill University of about, in modern dollars, about $400 million in the late 1800s. He had a bit of a grudge against the island for reasons I can't get into in this short lecture. Pressed for income, as I mentioned, Captain John, and he had a brother as well who had emigrated with him, enlisted in the Royal American Immigrants, a regiment raised in North America to serve with the British Army during the Revolutionary War. His brother was killed during the Revolutionary War, but as an officer, they received a steady income. And their sister Nellie ran the estate single-handedly in their absence. And got little, gratitude for it, other than a bunch of orders from John MacDonald and a negative opinion about anybody she thought she wanted to marry. Here's a bit of the numbers. 214, 300, 300, and then smaller groups that are too small to note. That immigration, and at the same time, people are pouring into the Antigonish area and Cape Breton area of Nova Scotia. For a period after the Revolutionary War, the Maritimes of Canada are the preeminent, destination for a lot of immigrants, especially from the Catholic Highlands. So in the 1750s, the number of Catholics in the Highlands was about 20,000. By 1800, there were only 8,000 left. And by 1828, less than 4,000. But on Prince Edward Island, 40% of the Scots on Prince Edward Island were Roman Catholics. Completely out of whack with the proportions in Scotland, and what we would, think to expect if we think of the character of Scotland. It's not, it's not really associated with the Catholic faith, but one of the reasons I like to joke why the Scots didn't run everything on Prince Edward Island, given their large kinds of numbers, was that they were split between multiple faiths and didn't really tend to cooperate with one another. So those are the Glenaladale MacDonalds. I want to now look at the Selkirk settlers, as they're known on Prince Edward Island. And again, Selkirk is a reference. This is a recreation, by the way, a painting to recreate the arrival of the Selkirk settlers on Prince Edward Island in August 1803. This is an immigrant, pivot that was established by Tommy Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, a philanthropist, colonizer, author, landlord, would-be political bigwig. Canadians know Lord Selkirk, but they don't know him because he had anything to do with us on Prince Edward Island. They know him because he founded a colony in Manitoba, which became the basis of the province of Manitoba at Red River. But that settlement was a failure. He had a settlement attempt in Baldoon, Ontario, which was an absolute failure. The only settlement project that succeeded for Douglas was his first one. And his first one was on Prince Edward Island, and it influenced the entire rest of his life. But this is what he's known for. That's why he's on a Canadian stamp, Manitoba. We get no respect here. Just saying, looks remarkably like Christopher Walken. So Lord Selkirk, let me back up just for a second. You can look at the resemblance. Lord Selkirk was a youngest son, and I had 4 brothers, perhaps older than he was. So he wasn't expected he would inherit his father's estate, which was a lucrative estate in the lowlands of Scotland. And so he went to university, to the University of Edinburgh, and he studied with some of the prominent minds there, and he acquired some of the common sense, philosophy. And I'm oversimplifying this, but essentially that people should try to make their lives useful, that they should advance the society in which they lived. So he had these ideas, and then in quick succession, his brothers all died. And all of a sudden he became heir to a major lucrative Scottish estate. So he had all these ideas about reform and improvement. He wanted to be a philanthropist, and now all of a sudden he had money. He also wanted to be in the House of Lords, but to be in the House of Lords, you had to be elected by the peers of Scotland. And so he needed to do something to raise his profile and convince people that he should be in the House of Lords. And by the way, he eventually did, although his career there was inconsequential. But he examined the problems of the Highlands, and this is what he came up with. Scotland, the Highlands of Scotland were suffering from too many people and not enough work. There wasn't enough income to go around. And the Highlands were modernizing. The clearances were sweeping through the Highlands. And there was a lot of suffering and out migration. And Selkirk said, okay, first, there's no going back. The Highlands and its economy have got to modernize if they're going to prosper. But, and this is remarkable because he's not a Highlander. He doesn't speak Gaelic. He tries to learn but he's not very good at it. He's a lowlander, but he conceives this great admiration for Highland Scots. And he felt that Highlanders had a right to preserve their traditional lifestyles, their language, and their customs. But right now, when Scottish clan chiefs were rationalizing their estates and modernizing their estates, they were simply evicting their tenants. And where were they going? Well, they were drifting into the cities of southern Scotland and England to work in the factories, or they were emigrating with a chip on their shoulders to places like the United States, which was Britain's enemy. So he said, why not, instead of just forcing people out of their homes and ignoring their plight, what if Scottish landlords assisted Highlanders, those excess Highlanders, to transplant their communities and their culture to British North America, where land was plentiful, the prospects were promising, and where they could become loyal, happy subjects of the British Empire instead of disaffected new Americans. So his original idea actually had nothing to do with Scotland. His original idea was, after the revolution or the rebellions in Ireland, was to transplant Irish rebels to Louisiana, which had 2 problems. First, Britain didn't own Louisiana. And second, the British authorities said, keep your nose out of Ireland. We've got it. So then he was going to transplant Scottish Highlanders, and he was going to transplant them to Ontario. He was going to acquire an estate from the government of Upper Canada and transplant as colonists there. And it was on those terms that he recruited them. And he offered them generous terms. Subsidized transportation to the New World in the days before the passenger liner, full provisions en route. You could buy land at 50 cents an acre or rent it for 999 years. And if you didn't like it, you got your money back and he would transport you back home with compensation for any improvements that you had made. And to top it all off, he would accompany the immigrants to the New World and make sure that the promises he had made were kept. That was a persuasive argument to tenants on the properties of the MacDonalds of Slate on the Isle of Skye, who weren't being evicted, but were being moved around within the estate onto crofts, who were being coerced into contributing their younger sons to the military regiment that the clan chief was raising for the British Army, and who were having to bid for the annual kind of renewal of their lease. So they made a people's choice. They decided they were going to move to Upper Canada. And then something happened. The government of Britain passed the Passenger Act, which was meant in 1803, which was meant to improve the conditions on board emigrant vessels, which the conditions were admittedly horrible. But the real reason was to limit the number of people you could take per vessel, to drive up the price of passage, to make it less possible for people to emigrate. Not only that, Scottish landlords pressured the government in Britain to pressure the government in Upper Canada not to give Lord Selkirk any land because they didn't want to lose the cheap pool of manpower for the military, for the kelping industry, and other enterprises. So the land deal fell through. So all of a sudden, the Highlanders on the Isle of Skye were all dressed up with no place to go. And Lord Selkirk had to move very quickly. So he bought 80,000 acres of land on Prince Edward Island. He said, okay, we can move to Prince Edward Island. And most of the Scots said, not any place I want to go, not any place I've heard of. And if I've heard of it, it's been negative. But then when the Passenger Act made it too expensive for them to emigrate on their own, they came back to Selkirk and they said, okay, we'll move to Prince Edward Island. At the last minute, 300 Catholic Highlanders from the island of Uist, South Uist, approached Lord Selkirk and said, can we get a lift to Prince Edward Island with you? Because we have relatives on Prince Edward Island, but we can't afford to charter a voyage ourselves. And so he brought 500 Scots from the Isle of Skye and Rasay, the offshore island, never to be confused with the Isle of Skye because they don't like that, and the mainland adjacent, mostly from the Trotternish area, this northern part of the Isle of Skye, 500 of them to his estate in Belfast. Now, people in Belfast hate to think that Belfast is named after the place in Ireland, the most Scottish place on Prince Edward Island, and they've come up with all kinds of rationales that they found a bell stuck fast in the swamp, or that the Acadians had called the place Belfast. It was named for Belfast, Ireland, but it is the most Scottish community on Prince Edward Island. 500 Scots arrived, 800 Scots all told, 300 of them moved on to the settlements that the Catholics had made on Prince Edward Island. 500 of them settled in Belfast in this area. Originally, he just had lot 57 and lot 58. Ultimately, Lord Selkirk's family extended their holdings on Prince Edward Island, but they did not become the philanthropists that their father had been. But that settlement in Belfast prospered almost immediately. These were among the best off of the tenants on the MacDonald's estate on the Isle of Skye. They were ticked off with their clan chief, and they picked up stakes and they moved, and they got land cheap, and they worked hard, and they prospered, and they sent for their kinfolk. And there is a chain of migration from Skye and Rasay and Rona and the mainland in Ross, 1821, 1820. Each time that there is a downturn on the Isle of Skye, there is a pulse of emigration to Prince Edward Island. More people came to Prince Edward Island from the Isle of Skye than went any place else in the world from Skye. And more people came from Skye to PEI than any other place in Scotland. It is the greatest single source of Scottish immigration. And it continues right until the end of immigration. These people in 1840, 41, they're being assisted by their landlord because they're being cleared. Not so sure about 1858 and 1861, 63. This is a distribution of Scots on PEI. This is born in Scotland in 1848. It's a bit misleading because by that time there are many, many islanders born on Prince Edward Island, but of Scottish origin. But as you can see, central Queens County, southern Kings County here. But this area, for example, doesn't look like it has a lot of Scots. It does. It's just that those people are Scots Islanders born on Prince Edward Island. Varying assessments of the Scots as settlers, some of them by their own kind, some of them, many of them by English observers who tend to look down their nose at Highland Scots. Captain John MacDonald, unhappy because people wouldn't do what they were told. He said, the Highlanders are, no, he quotes the governor of the colony saying that Highlanders have been 16 years in the island and they and their pigs have the same apartments. Their bishop, who was a MacEachern from the Highlands of Scotland, a Catholic bishop, said, our people are extravagant in tea drinking, dress, grog, and horse racing. I look at that and I go, yeah, that's pretty good. Walter Johnston, a lowland Scot, thought the Highlanders were miserable farmers. They know nothing about cultivating land, the comforts of a good house or a well-furnished table. Having procured plenty of fish and potatoes and rum, they neither wished nor sought for more. And Captain John complaining that Highlanders were volatile, quick to despair, quick to gloat. Well, the experts say, as opposed to the observers at the time, that Highland Scots make very good settlers in this time period in virgin wilderness because they're used to farming land where the amount of arable land is scattered in small plots over a rocky hillside. So they use hand plows. They're used to planting in little spots, like a patch of dirt here and there. So for planting among stumps and in a wilderness, fantastic. Being willing to put up with the climate and with the extremes, the privations, great. However, they had moved to the New World to recreate the standard of living they had known in the Old World. And when they had done that, they tended to be content and they felt they had better things to do with their time than to get rich for the sake of getting rich. And that tended to irk the other observers. This is a poem translated from the Gaelic by one of the emigrants to Belfast, Malcolm Ban Buchanan. And it's a longer poem called Emigration of the Islanders. But this is one part of it. This is the voice of the Highland Scot on Prince Edward Island themselves. This is the Isle of Contentment where we are now. Our seed fruitful here, oats grow and wheat in full bloom, turnip, cabbage, and peas. Sugar from trees may be had free. Maple syrup. We have it in large chunks. There is fresh red rum in every dwelling and shop, abundant as the stream being imbibed there. I could quote you poems by Highland Scots who felt overwhelmed by the wilderness and by the climate, or who were isolated amid English settlers. But this, from many, many of those Scots, this was the Isle of Contentment. What did that do for Prince Edward Island? I'm just getting to the very end here now. What did that do for Prince Edward Island? Well, if you look at the composition of the population at the end of the settlement era, 45% Scottish, most of that Highland, 25% Irish. That means that 70% of Prince Edward Island were of Celtic origin. I'm not trying to say that Scots and Irish would necessarily mingle, although my mother was Irish. English, 20% Acadian, French, 10%, Mi'kmaq, about 300. The religious landscape, 45% Roman Catholic, the largest single denominational group in the colony, of which half were Scots. And then the next largest group, surprise, surprise, the Presbyterian, various Presbyterian churches, and then Methodists and Anglicans. Prince Edward Island is overwhelmingly Scottish. It is overwhelmingly Celtic. As I mentioned, Gaelic was the most common language after English, not French. The Gaelic language, perhaps the purest badge of culture, lingered on Prince Edward Island, but gradually faded out, unlike Cape Breton, where the language persists, although it's endangered there as well. But on Prince Edward Island, the last fluent speaker of Gaelic died in 2003. Anybody who speaks it now is a recent immigrant from Scotland or learned it in school. And yet, Islanders are proud of their ancestry. They're proud of their Highlandness. The fiddle, which was the instrument brought to the New World by the Scots. People associate fiddle music with the Cape Breton fiddle music sound, but there is a lively traditional fiddle culture on Prince Edward Island as well, much influenced by Scots. Even the Acadians and Irish, they play Scottish tunes. Scottish belief systems, superstitions permeate the oral history of Prince Edward Island. And while Islanders don't necessarily have a firm grasp of their history, they have a lively sense of their history, and they're proud to be Scots. So that's all I have to say. I'm open for questions, and I will stop sharing, I think, so that I can see you.
Bravo, thank you, thank you.
By the way, I'm drinking water, not rum.
Questions, please.
Yeah,
I have one. Oh,
Go ahead.
my question is,
Hi, Gus.
what's being done around archaeology digs on the island? Is that a robust field?
That's a really good question. For many, many years, we did not have a provincial archaeologist. So any archaeological digs that were done by representatives at the federal government level, usually with national parks. And Indigenous archaeological digs tended to dominate. There was an archaeological dig at an early settlement established by the French, but later on the site of Highland Scots settlement. Now we have a provincial archaeologist, and just in the last 2 years, they have been doing an archaeological dig at the Glenaladale estate and discovering the remnants of the home Captain John MacDonald had built there in the 1780s. But it's not as robust an archaeological landscape as one would hope, simply because of lack of resources.
I got a question on when Prince Edward Island became a province.
Yes.
I believe it was 1871 or so.
It was 1873, yeah.
Now, prior to that, was it considered part of Nova Scotia?
No, that's a good question as well, though. In 1763, when we officially were transferred to British ownership, we were part of the province of Nova Scotia, or the colony of Nova Scotia, which at that point included also the island in New Brunswick. In 1769, the proprietors who had acquired the land on Prince Edward Island, they didn't want to be ruled by anybody in Halifax, partly because they didn't trust them, but also because in the winter, the island was completely isolated by ice. And so they lobbied the British authorities to create a colony on Prince Edward Island with a government of its own. And they promised that it wouldn't cost the government of Britain a cent, because the landlords would pay the cost of government with their rents, their quit rents. So the British agreed, and in 1769, a colony of Prince Edward Island with a government of its own was established. It never paid for itself. The landlords never did anything that they said they would do, but the colony managed to survive. And thus, when Confederation happened in 1867, we rightly believed that we had nothing to gain from joining it, and we stayed out. However, we got railway fever in 1871 and decided we would build a trans-island railway, which we could not afford. And the government was so deeply in debt that it turned to Canada and asked for terms of confederation. And so we ended up joining Confederation as a province in 1873 because we had been a colony. But we do advertise ourselves as the birthplace of Confederation, even though we didn't join, because there was a conference here in 1864 that started the ball rolling, which led directly to Confederation. So for touristic kinds of reasons, we're very keen on being the birthplace of Canada, but we didn't join. I'm just looking at the chat feature. Can you comment on Prince Henry Sinclair from the Orkney Islands? His travels took him to Massachusetts. That's an interesting, it's an interesting prospect there, without getting too far into it, because the person who's doing the research is keeping it under their hat at the moment. There is a person on Prince Edward Island who is investigating the possibility that there are artifacts which suggest a presence, possibly Scottish, on Prince Edward Island up to 1,000 years ago. And so whether that's Prince Henry, Sinclair, you know, there is a whole speculative history strain that has Scots and another strain that has Irish people in the region as well, Irish monks. So I don't know where that will lead, but I know there's a person who's very much on the case and working on it. I think it unlikely they came to Prince Edward Island, but I have been known to be wrong more than once.
You know, my family came a lot later. My great-grandfather was born in 1841.
Okay.
I believe in Scotland. I haven't been able to confirm that. I was at the MacDonald Cultural Center on Skye.
Oh yeah, the Caledonia Center.
Yes. And I worked with a genealogist there. And
was this, you know, recently? There
no,
was a
this
Maggie
was,
MacDonald there who was very, very good years ago.
Yeah, no, this was probably 15 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
But I thought I found my great-grandfather, and but when I did a little more research, it turned out they migrated to Nova Scotia and around 1841. But I was thinking that maybe Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia had the same name at that time. And I was thinking, well, that wasn't my great-grandfather, because he went to Nova Scotia, not to Prince Edward Island. But were they the same at the time?
No, they wouldn't have been. However, there were lots of people in Cape Breton, settled in Cape Breton, who had kinspeople who had settled on Prince Edward Island, and there was some movement back and forth. So some people did end up moving from the island to Cape Breton, and from Cape Breton and the mainland of Nova Scotia also to Prince Edward Island, but they would have been thought of as two distinct, you know, kinds of, you know, locales. And they were literally and politically and at that time separate.
Yeah,
But
well,
as you know, there's a tendency in the United States, I don't know about your part of, you know, the US, but there's a tendency in the US to think of the maritime area as that's Nova Scotia. It's one name they associate with the whole region. If people know about us on Prince Edward Island, it's often because it's the home of Anne of Green Gables,
right.
which a lot of people fell in love with. But they would be separate entities at that time.
Well, my family, the research I've done, we're from Lot 22, a place called Clyde Station.
Oh yeah, Clyde River area.
Yeah, later on, it looked like they dropped the station on it. I guess the railroad station must have been removed
Yeah.
from Clyde. And
Yeah, there's a Clyde River, which is a community, an interior community in the center of Queens County that is very, very Scottish. Yeah. What's the family name?
McLeod.
Oh yeah, MacLeod. There, MacLeod. MacLeod is the second commonest Scottish name on Prince Edward Island, and then Campbell. But the commonest name is actually MacDonald, and then Arsenault and Gallant, which are Acadian names. You would normally associate the MacLeods with the Belfast area, but there are MacLeods all over the island for sure. Someone was asking, where does one contact a PEI source of genealogical records for Montague? Well, having gone to high school in Montague, I don't think I count as a genealogical source. But the Provincial Archives of Prince Edward Island now is the biggest repository for records that would pertain to Montague. And there is a genealogical website called the Island Register, where you can go online and ask, hey, is there anybody who's got any research on this family in Montague? What family name in Montague?
I'm a MacLeod, Victoria Cross, Montague, but Victoria Cross to be more specific. Anniers.
Oh yeah. There are lots of Anniers.
My uncle was, my aunt was Darling Annier. My father, but it's very hard because there's so many similar names, the repetition of the name John MacLeod, and there's 50 million John MacLeods.
In the census of 1901, for example, in Kings County alone, there were 121 individuals named John MacDonald.
Yeah.
John MacLeod, again, would be difficult to single out. However, actually, my brother lives in Victoria Cross currently.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure how many MacLeods are left there, but there are lots of MacLeods in the Montague area. But that would be my advice, would be the Public Archives and Records Office of Prince Edward Island and the website that I mentioned.
Okay.
The creator of that website unfortunately has died, but the website still is a great meeting place for people that do PEI genealogy.
But I have a unique distinction because I believe from the little bit I've been able to research, I think the family was on our Selkirk settlement. I'm not really sure, but because I haven't been able to fully research it. That's on my dad's side, MacLeod. However, my dad married a Ukrainian into a Ukrainian-Russian family outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, who settled on another Selkirk plot. So
in Manitoba.
In Manitoba, probably around the same time.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It was real. I was doing it for something for Louis Riel, Métis and all that. And I fell on where my family lives in Manitoba. And I went, oh my goodness.
Yeah. So you have two interesting, connections intersecting, which is unusual.
Yeah. So it makes me purely Canadian.
Well, and we welcome our friends and our Canadian roots. So many, the most common place for Islanders to go to between 1880 and the Second World War was to the Boston States, as it was called, which was the New England area as far south as getting into the, New York and New Jersey, like in Pennsylvania. So not just in New England, but it was called the Boston States. And hundreds of thousands of people from the Maritimes went there. And tens of thousands of Islanders went there. And from there, they spread all over the whole state, the country of the United States. Someone asked, do you have a book with this PEI history and maps? How do we keep in contact with you? We were Catholic, and immigration of my ancestor was 1772. The Glenaladale estate is now in the hands of a not-for-profit organization, and they have been trying to preserve the most recent of the homes in Glenaladale, which was built in 1882, and what's left of the estate, because the estate is now reduced to 500 acres. They have done quite a bit of work and published a couple of books about the Glenaladale settlers and tried to recreate family trees, or tried to do I'm sorry, I shouldn't say a family trees, but they've tried to do a recreation of the passenger list, because there is not a formal list. So my email is on the website for the University of Prince Edward Island, and you could easily find it there. I'm just going to type it here for anybody that wants to follow up with me. G.E. MacDonald. Much frou frou about MC MacDonald and big D's and small D's. Just for the record, linguists will tell you that it would be a big D and it would be M-A-C, but the right way to spell your name is the way you spell it.
Excuse me, Professor MacDonald. I would like to interrupt just for a moment because our president from Caledonia and Chicago Scots has joined us. And Gus, I wanted to call upon you to say a few words as well, and then we can go back to some more discussion. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Connie, and what a fantastic presentation. I came just a few minutes after you started, so I'm terribly sorry for missing the beginning and the opening remarks, but I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't have any Canadian roots or family myself, but it was one of the best presentations I've heard. Terrific. Thank you very much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
I wanted to encourage everyone to come to the Feast of the Haggis. I think Dawn has already said something at the beginning of the conversation, but I encourage everybody to come to do one thing with me, if you don't do anything else, and that's to celebrate Connie Nestor, who is our kinswoman of the year this year, in recognition of her dedication to the board and to this organization, this history forum. Connie's given incredible leadership to it and has hosted and arranged these wonderful lectures and presentations on Saturday mornings. So it gives us the opportunity to give back a little of what Connie has given, and a huge thank you to her for all you've done, Connie.
It's been a privilege. I'm here to serve. Thank you very much.
I'm looking at the chat feature and I'm seeing a lot of applause.
And Gus, you're headed for Scotland tomorrow.
On Monday, yes.
Monday, forgive me.
The Billie Jean King tennis tournament is going to be happening in Glasgow. It's a tournament for women's teams, international teams, and it's from the 8th through the 13th of November. There are two people in Scotland who don't know I'm coming, and that's my mother and my father. So I'm surprising them. At the end of a couple of days, I'm going to shoot down to the borders and visit with them and surprise them. I'm really looking forward to it. The reason I'm going is one of our society's best friends and supporters is the Magellan Corporation, and they are sponsoring the tennis tournament. They're very close to Billie Jean King, who herself has Scottish roots. If you haven't looked at those, Billie Jean King is very proud of her family's heritage from Scotland. So I'll be looking to bring her closer to the Chicago Scots while I'm over there. But there's a couple of other visits I'll be making to the University of Glasgow, to the National Trust of Scotland, and a few others while I'm there. But I fly back on the 16th of November, and that might seem like a kind of random date, but it was quite intentional that I picked that date because I moved from Scotland to Chicago on the 16th of November, 1992, exactly 30 years ago. And I had a sense of what it must have been like for some of the people you talked about today in the presentation, contemplating the journey and thinking about new lives and new homes and so on. And that was certainly what was in my mind 30 years ago when I jumped onto that plane and wide-eyed made my way to Chicago.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip.
Thanks, Bill. Hey, Bill, it's good to hear you. I don't see you, but it's good to hear you.
I'm here. Prince Edward Island is close to my heart.
I know it is.
There's a lovely sense of occasion in your comments, and your comments are too kind. But you know, I'm kind of reminded of this fellow who came to Prince Edward Island. He was English. He was actually recruited to come out in 1774, and he was told that you could shoot the game out of the window of your cabin, and that the climate was mild. He said, "Such accounts I sucked like sack." Well, I sucked in your compliment like sack. And I would doubt the veracity of them, except for the compliment you made to Connie, which must be true. Therefore, your comments that the talk was okay must be true. So I just was referring to the chat feature about Rick Gillis telling us that he is a descendant of a Roderick Gillis from Lot 13, which is the western part of Prince Edward Island, and came out from the Isle of Skye to PI about 1790. Yes, actually, MacCachren did come out in 1790 with about 300 people, although they were from the island of South Uist for the most part. Not many Catholics on the Isle of Skye, but that's not to say that they weren't on the island, that you know your ancestor wasn't on the Isle of Skye. But definitely 1790 is when he arrived and began 45 years of missionary work on Prince Edward Island. You know, MacCachren was an absolutely admirable and remarkable person with the common touch, who devoted his whole life to his people. And his people were whoever the Catholics were, from the Mi'kmaq to the French to the Irish, although he had some problems with the Irish. And of course, his Highland Scots, who were his people. So Rick, you and I should pursue this a little bit further. I might be able to find out a little bit more about that voyage that I could share with you, and maybe you could share some information with me.
That would be great. That would be great. Yeah, my father had done, I've got piles of research here. And and I remember as a child going to PEI, and the whole trip was going through cemeteries. And so we've got all that information. And in fact, the trip I made my children go to when they were young, we were able to find the, what do they call it? The ancestral cemetery.
A pioneer cemetery.
Yeah, Pioneer Cemetery, where the woman at the museum, we started talking about it, and this very old gentleman took us back there. He knew where it was from when he was a child, and it was right near the water, of course, because there were no roads. Everything was done by boat back then.
Yeah.
And they were very excited because as we went through there, as a child, he had knocked down all the stones on purpose to keep them from, I know you're shaking your head, but to keep the rain from destroying the old stones.
Okay, yeah, so the inscriptions, especially if the stones were the sandstone, red sandstone, then the inscriptions would be at risk.
Yeah, so it was a fascinating trip, but yes, we can touch base some point and share our information here.
I was worried that the story was going to be like a cemetery here on Longworth Avenue, which had been abandoned in favor of a new one. And it was kind of a derelict site, and they took the tombstones and used them as a breastwork in the park on the waterfront.
Oh,
Not
it was a good
popular
story in the end.
Yeah, that's a much happier story. Anne-Marie asked whether early Scots settlers would have known or heard about the Acadian expulsion. Pretty much impossible to answer, although I will say that the Scots who came to Belfast have a long tradition of recognizing that Acadians had been briefly on that site beforehand and had respected a cemetery that they had found with Acadians in it. Now, they were a different racial, not a different racial group, but different ethnic, religious, and language group. But the Scots in Belfast, who have a very lively sense of history, and they have respected and protected that heritage while doing the same for their own. How much they would have known about the deportation of the Acadians is doubtful. However, there were still Acadians on Prince Edward Island at that time. About 1/10 of the population were Acadians who had either escaped from the deportation or returned to Prince Edward Island after the deportation. For example, my mother-in-law, her family were deported in 1758 and returned to Prince Edward Island from France. They were deported to France in the early 1780s and settled back on Prince Edward Island. So they would have seen Acadians around them, depending on what part of the island they lived in. The Catholic Scots who settled in Tracadie, the Scotch Fort area, as it was called, they were occupying, in some cases, land that the Acadians had farmed, but those Acadians had been deported. And the Acadians' attitude, those that escaped or returned from the deportation, was to avoid contact with the authorities. Because what had happened when they got enmeshed in the political roils of the kinds of imperial, would-be powers, their lives were ruined, their lives were devastated. And so they kept to themselves for many decades and had as little to do with the Anglos as was necessary. So I don't think they knew a lot. A century later, they're exploring it and they're fascinated by it.
Professor MacDonald, I think we may have time for one more question, and then I regret I'll make an announcement and probably need to adjourn the meeting. Are there any more pressing questions? We all have Ed's email address, and I have a couple questions for you, Ed, so I'll be in touch. But more questions or comments?
Thank you.
And Barbara starting the applause. Well, I don't know how to thank you, Dr. MacDonald, for being with us this morning. This has just been fascinating and very value added. And I know there's a great deal of excitement and enthusiasm. So we'd like to have you back again to speak. I'll be in touch with you about that. And anybody who didn't get the email address, just reach out to me. I'll be happy to give you Professor MacDonald's address. But I do want to urge everybody, please come to our December 2nd gala. It's going to be wonderful. And don't forget, our next History Forum meeting will be January 14th, second Saturdays, 10:30 a.m. in year 2023. And so on that note, if I don't see you, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and enjoy the holiday season. Thank you.
And thank you to Jack for doing such a great job
Jack.
with
I
the
always thank
technology.
Jack and forgot. Jack, forgive me. Jack, thank you for everything you do for us.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
Jack, thanks for everything you do for me.
And thank you, Gus, for everything you do.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much. It was nice to meet a lot of you even in a virtual way. And hopefully it's a conversation we'll be able to carry on. Scots need to hang together. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.